Welcome to another .NET user group with a focus on Blazor from sunny Bournemouth in Dorset, part of the .NET Foundation. Well, it's great that you've been able to join us yet again for another presentation around Azure, .NET and Blazor. So, what have we got in store for you today? Our guest speaker today is Jon Hilton, who will be talking about how to build a search engine with Blazor and Tailwind CSS. We'd also like to thank our community sponsor Syncfusion for their community license of their Blazor components and also their support for our group, enabling us to give away swag and other goodies. This video forms part one of a two-part presentation where Jon will be helping us to get up and running with Blazor with a whistle-stop tour of Blazor's component model. Well, we're certainly looking forward to this one. Let's dive right in.
The first thing I wanted to look at today then is about Blazor and specifically how it does or does not compare to JavaScript Frameworks. So the first thing is, can everybody see the screen, my presentation that I'm showing? It should say up and running with Blazor. Okay, so the first thing I should probably say, just to preempt any unfortunate situation that could arise, is I do have two young children, aged 7 and 4, and they have a habit of being unpredictable. So all those cute videos you've seen on the internet of BBC News interviews where the child wanders in and starts, causing havoc. It's really cute until it's your own child and your own presentation. So if that happens, I will just apologize and, throw them out of the room. See how that goes. The other thing I should just say, this presentation has been rated. It is PG-13. All I would say is it does contain occasional mild references to JavaScript and JS frameworks and intense scenes of code compilation and waiting for the browser to refresh, because with Blazor, that's kind of what we have at the moment. So if that's going to trigger anybody, you're probably best to leave now just before we get too much further into it. So here's the next thing I'd like to, if you head to the chat, I'm going to show something on the screen in a second. And I would just invite you to share your immediate emotion, feeling, thought, reaction, whatever just comes to mind. It's like one of those crazy word association games. So I'm just going to show you this now and see what your reaction is. Vomit, I mean, that's a strong start. Cool, dodgy. There you go, the S should be uppercase. Help. Monster, I mean, anyone would think JavaScript had a bad reputation with C# developers. So the interesting thing with JavaScript is I don't actually mind it. I think it's, a bit of tongue in cheek to mock JavaScript at this point, especially with Blazor. But I'm going to guess that as well as thinking JavaScript, what you probably thought when you saw that come up, because they're kind of synonymous at this point, is JavaScript Framework. So I think when we think of JavaScript in 2020, inevitably you probably also go in your head to one of these frameworks or all of them. And whether or not you've used them, these are kind of high profile. And in many ways, JavaScript development is these frameworks for most people at this point. There's not that many people just doing vanilla JS when they're doing software development. And these frameworks are, different in some ways. So I've recently had a very strange experience right at the beginning of lockdown where I decided to rebuild one of my websites. And I thought, I'll try, I can't remember how this decision came about, but I think I'd heard that Gatsby was really supposed to be amazing. And having done a lot of React development, I thought, I'll give that a go. And I think I got like maybe a few days in and then it was just causing problems. And I was like, now I'm learning GraphQL for some reason. And it just, blew up. So I was like, no, I'm not doing that. So then I tried, I think I tried Vue for a little while. And then I tried something else. I don't think it was Angular, but one of the others. And then eventually I kind of went with Blazor for a bit. And actually it ran as the Blazor project for a while, Blazor server. And that worked really well for what it was doing at the time. And then Blazor WebAssembly came along, so I thought about migrating it to Blazor WebAssembly. And I think at some point I may have even tried Svelte. So it was a crazy period just when lockdown started and everyone was in that kind of weird state that we were in, and the children were at home, and my wife's working at home, and I'm trying to work at home. And at the same time, I've got this weird Groundhog Day of going through every possible JavaScript framework and Blazor that you've ever heard of, and trying to build the same thing in lots of different frameworks. And it was a surreal experience and pretty stressful. But what I did realize, and this is what I wanted to look at today really, is that actually JavaScript, for all of its merits and problems, along with these frameworks, has given us something which I think is really useful, and which is actually at the core of Blazor, which is the component model. So Blazor's component model definitely draws on the best parts of JavaScript frameworks. So having used React a lot in recent years, I think that's probably the closest in terms of some of the ideas, but there's definitely some influence there. And so I think that's good. And to understand why that's good, just before we dive into actual code, it's probably just worth considering what the difference is. So if you consider, I don't know, an MVC app or web forms even, and definitely Razor pages, they all have essentially one thing in common, which is that what you do when you make a request in your browser to the web server is you are making a request for, a page, so saying, please go to /contact us, and what you get back is a page, generally speaking. So the mindset that we're in when we're building apps in this way is kind of entire pages. That's how we think. And then if you want to go to the about page, /about server renders the HTML, CSS, sends it back as a whole page. And what, going back a bit now, but this JavaScript changed here was that it kind of raised this prospect of the single page application. So the gist is that now you would go to your site /contact, but under the hood, what that would actually do is interpret that request on the client side and basically just forwards everything to index.html or some equivalent, so that what you get back from the server, generally speaking, is your whole application. And then as you're navigating between pages and interacting with your application, for the most part, it's already loaded in the browser in terms of HTML, CSS, JavaScript. There is a bit of gray area there because as with all these things, they tend to go all the way in one direction and then all the way back again, flip-flop for a bit, and then find themselves in the middle. So there are some issues with single page applications, usually around, indexing for search engines and performance and that kind of thing. So common now with this kind of development is to kind of do both. So you actually have pre-rendering on the server so that when you hit a page for the first time, it actually loads as a page from the server. So it's fast and it indexes well for search engines. And then it kind of progressively loads in the rest of the application on top. But that's kind of where we're at. So it's interesting where, if we now think about JavaScript frameworks, so yes, they return the whole application to the browser for the most part. But what does that actually mean for you, the developer? So how are you now to develop your applications if you're using a JavaScript framework? Well, this is the thing that all the JavaScript frameworks share. And from the bitter experience of the beginning of lockdown, I can confirm this to be the case. They all revolve around a component model. So this is the idea that you can take any application, break it down into smaller components, and then build those components and then kind of compose them back together to make the larger application. And just looking at this example, the BBC homepage from a few weeks ago, that's essentially how you could build this using a JavaScript framework. You could say, well, look, there's a kind of story here and the section has lots of stories, and I'm going to build a section component and then a story component that I can loop through some data and render lots of those in there and that kind of thing. And where does this leave us? So as a C# developer, we've kind of sat in the background, depending on, and I think it's wrong to generalize because, I'm ostensibly a C# developer who's also spent ages building React projects. But there is this kind of feeling that, again, the good and the bad of JavaScript, but those guys and girls over there do seem to be having fun to some extent and being productive and actually building interesting apps. And I think the bit that really saves JavaScript and actually kind of propels it and makes it useful is this component-based approach. And then we're kind of sitting over here with C# going, well, what can we do? We can do razor pages or MVC and get whole pages back. But, you know, can we not kind of go down that component road in some way? And for me, that is where Blazor comes in. So if we kind of put aside all the other things that Blazor brings, the hosting models, server, WebAssembly, and the kind of technicalities of it, in terms of you as a developer building your application, what you're actually going to be doing is building components. And that's where we kind of suddenly get to some glimpse into what the JavaScript development world has been doing for a few years now. So what I'd like to do at this point is now switch to the code. So again, it's in the chat, but you should have hopefully the code if you did want to grab hold of it yourselves. I'll just put that link out there again. So if you pull that down and stick to the master branch, you'll be pretty much where I am when I start this. So I will just switch over to that one now. Okay. So I'm sorry to subject you to it, but we are going to just start with Hello World and then very quickly move on to something else more interesting. But this is actually useful in Blazor to just show something quite simple. So first of all, George, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see code on the left? Perfect, thank you. So Hello World, what are we looking at? We're looking at a Blazor application here, which I already created. And this has some things that we're going to work through here. But the first thing is, what do we do to show this? So if you look on the browser on the right-hand side, this is just a blank page. And then there's this component. So how do we kind of bring these two things together? Well, if I open up index.razor, a bit of routing here means that when we go to the home page of our app, we're going to end up at this page. And if we want to show our greeting, we just need to know what it's called and then reference it as though it were a HTML tag, but what it actually is a greeting.razor. So there's a bit of convention going on there that the name of the file, in this case, greeting.razor, is the name we can use to render it. Now, when I save this, this is where that intense scenes of compilation and browser refreshing starts to rear its head, because one of the current, I think, weaknesses, if you like, of Blazor, which I think the team are aware of at Microsoft, is this feedback loop. So actually making changes and seeing them come to life in the browser is not as fast as JavaScript development has made us expect, which can be frustrating. And there is one way to mitigate it. So if I just cancel this for a minute, and instead of doing .NET Run, which will build and run the app, do .NET Watch Run, this kind of half solves the problem. So what this does with this Blazor WebAssembly project is it says whenever I make a change now, it's going to kick in and recompile, which we can then use this URL here to refresh and have a look. And we've got our Hello World. So this is an improvement because it means I can make changes and the recompiling will happen automatically, but I still have to refresh the browser. And I think this is where we'll see improvements, if not for .NET 5, certainly, you know, soon-ish, I would suggest. So you are not going to get far in Blazor without some kind of one-way binding. So this is probably the most common and actually one of the most useful things we can do is to say, well, look, we actually want to bind here to some kind of field in our code. So we can write C# now, and we can say, look, here's a name, just hard code it for a moment. And then use standard one-way binding syntax to show that. So when we request this page, Blazor is going to essentially render this page. It's going to then interpolate the value of name with this markup here, and it should show us a more friendly greeting if your name's John. Not much help if it isn't. This actually will get us quite a long way in Blazor, because if you think about it, a lot of applications we might be building, there's going to be a lot of showing data, and that's, you know, that covers that, hits that checkbox. And because this is C#, you can do C#-y kind of things. So if you really wanted to, even up here, actually, you could do .2 upper because it's C#, or you could do that down here, because this is also C# and it's a string. So this is the thing that we've not had before, is we've now got a component model and we're writing C#, which I think a lot of us are finding to be really quite productive, not least because it sidelines all the JavaScript, all the stuff that comes with JavaScript, like the ecosystem and the build pipelines and all that other stuff as well. But we wouldn't get too far if all we did was one-way binding to show information on the screen. So sooner or later, you're going to probably want to get input from the user as well. And we can do that. I'll show you one way, and then a little bit later, we'll look at another way. But if we just kind of stick to basics for a minute, say I just put a text input here for a second. Now, what we might want to do is say, well, look, you can put your name in here. So if I just say, what's your name? So what we're really looking to do now is bind this to our name property. So this can be done in Blazor just using some syntax. It's worth noting, by the way, I'm using JetBrains Rider here. And as you can see, when you do some things, it's not yet brilliant at this. So it's kind of made up something there that I don't want to do. So it's a bit hit and miss at this point. But I think as with all these things, it's coming in terms of support. So we do this now. So what we've got is two-way binding. So if I just refresh this now when the compilation is finished, so you can see this down here is recompiling every time that we make a change. And the way two-way binding works is that it actually takes the value of underscore name on the first render and then shows that in the input. And under the hood, it's going to raise an event when we actually change this value to go the other way and update underscore name. So when I now put something else in here, you'll notice that it's changing, but it's also changing on blur, essentially. So when I actually leave that text box, that's when that two-way binding kicks in, which is in some scenarios what you'd want. And then in other cases, you might think, well, actually, can I not, is there no way of doing that a bit more immediately? So maybe as I'm typing, I want that value to instantly update for some reason, maybe for a search or some kind of search autocomplete or something like that. And you can do, it's a slight variation on the syntax we've already used, where we do bind hyphen value and an event. So what we're doing with this in Blazor is we're saying, well, actually, we're hooking into different, remember this is client side. So we're actually hooking into essentially DOM things here, like DOM events. And what we're saying is that we want to change which event we hook into to trigger that two-way binding in Blazor. And what we can do here is just say on input instead. Let that recompile. And now as I change this, it changes instantly. Now, I would argue you may not want to call your database every single time you type in a letter in this input. I guess it depends on the application and what you're doing there, but that might be too much load. But there are times when, if you've got all your data client side, for example, that kind of instant filtering of that data or something like that can be really useful. And obviously we don't need to stick to on input, we can tap into other events here. So far so good. But what I really want to look at is essentially how we can move on from this kind of the building blocks to some more useful examples. And then what we'll do in the second demo is we'll actually bring Tailwind CSS into the picture, and we'll kind of go from scratch to a search engine to search for Marvel characters using the things we're looking at here. So this is just kind of getting our bearings and understanding what the building blocks are. And one of the building blocks you would need in most applications is a form. So if we have a look at this, now this is kind of doing it ourselves, and then I'll show you a way that Blazor, a few tricks that Blazor has up its sleeves for forms. But this is just a standard HTML form. So we have a label. I mean, it's not really a form even at this point, it's just an input. And what we've said is there is some kind of button that will submit this, in speech quotes form. And what we're trying to do here is essentially take the value that they've entered, and then we would at this point be posting this to the server, or sending an email or whatever it is that we might actually be doing with this. So we've already seen two-way binding, so that's going to take care of updating the underscore email field value at the point that we type something in. But how can we get it into this method here so that we click the button and then we submit the data? What we can do for that is tap into another DOM event, which is on click, and literally just point it at that method. So at this point, we've said that when we click this button, we're going to call handle submit, and we're relying on the two-way binding that's already happening to basically get that email field up to date for us. And then at this point, we can just, write this to the console. The first time I did this in Blazor WebAssembly, I wondered what was going to happen, and it turns out it does exactly what you'd expect it to do or hope it would do, which is write to the developer tools browser console. So we can prove that this works if we just say, submitted form, and then throw in the current value of email in here, if I can type. So we'll just do that in there. So there's an interesting thing in JetBrains Rider, by the way, which is that you don't have to save. So when you leave, when I essentially leave, this loses focus and I go over here, it automatically saves. But I have such a habit of pressing Control S that it never gets a chance to save for me. So there you go. Habits are hard to break once they exist. So we just say now, hello, what's your name, John? And we'll open the developer tools and then just see what happens when we submit this. So, sorry, I'm on the wrong example. That would help, wouldn't it? So if I just go to the index page and we'll render this over there. So this is the key difference, as we discussed at the beginning, between building with components and returning pages. So this is our index page, and it's actually a component itself. So although we're calling it a page, what we're really saying is this is also a component. We're just choosing to display it and render it when we go to / in our application. And what we can then do in here is show other components. So in this case, the email capture form, as well as our greeting, and we'll get rid of this HR in a minute, but just to prove the point. Okay, there's our form. So if I just say, put an email address in here and press submit, and then the console.writeLine comes in, and there it is. If you have done JavaScript development, you do not need to feel ashamed that every now and again you'll fall into bad habits and write console.log instead. That's a fairly common occurrence while I'm switching between the two languages at the moment. So that's kind of doing our own, and again, speech quotes form, because it's not really a form, but it shows how we can take an on-click event and wire that up basically to a method, and then do whatever we want to do with that, and just relying on two-way binding to bring this value, keep this value in sync here. But as I said, Blazor has other tricks up its sleeves for handling forms, and they're actually really useful. So one thing I'm always a bit wary of in any framework is too much magic. And I think the reason for that is because if there's too much magic, I feel like I don't have control over what's happening. And more importantly, if it breaks, I don't know how to fix it. I think Blazor at the moment treads a pretty good line on that, because things like this edit form, which we're now going to look at, I mean, they are kind of magic in that they do some things for you. But actually, if you dig into this, it's not so much magic that it would be scary. You can figure, it's possible to know what this is doing because it's not actually that complicated. And I think the value outweighs the fact that it's doing some things for you. So if we look at this, what we have is this idea of an edit form. So this is also a component, but it's a component built into Blazor. And it can accept a model. So a model, in this case, is literally a C# class. So we've got this class down here, email form, and we've instantiated one of those and we've assigned it to _model. So the edit form is just pointing to that. So it will keep track of things like changes and validation and that kind of thing for that model. And then we can say, well, look, when the form is valid and it gets submitted, call this method, which is handle valid submit, and then we're back to our console.writeLine. Now, at the moment, this isn't doing any validation, but if I just quickly pop it on the index page so we can see again that this does actually indeed work. So what are we? Email edit form. Refresh. Okay, so there you go. So we have a form, this edit form. Now, if we look at that, currently I can basically just leave that blank and press submit, and it's going to call the console.log. But validation is one of those things that it's strange because we have to do it quite a lot, and it's either, again, magic or way too fiddly. And depending on the framework, you either have to just use a library or create your own. So in the case of React, there are libraries, but React itself doesn't include anything for validation. So it's a case of using npm to bring in a package that does validation, or just wiring it up yourself. And obviously, we could wire this up ourselves, but I think actually validation is probably one of Blazor's strongest points in terms of what you can do very easily out of the box. So you can essentially, we'll start this way, annotate this, and you don't have to use data annotations, but it is a kind of quick way to get up and running. And then we'll just bring this reference in. So import, you'll see up there, it's now saying using system.componentModel data annotations. So this is just, if you've done development with .NET, at some point you've probably stumbled across data annotations. And there are alternatives, so you can use Fluent validation, for example. But this is now required. But at the moment, if we try this, it's still just going to let us go straight through that without any validation. Just check that that's the case. There you go. So now it's just lying to us because it says that's valid when it clearly isn't. But what we can do is bring in another component here, which is the data annotations validator. And now if I refresh that over here, when it's recompiled, now if I try and submit this, it's instantly honored the data annotations and put a little red box around this for us. So under the hood, what that's done is that's given that a class which is invalid, and there's a style in the CSS for this site that says, oh, if it's invalid, I'll make it red. So it's not magic in that case. It's just, adding a CSS class there. In terms of what else you can do with that, obviously you can just validate it, but you may want to show a message saying, well, hang on, the user's going, why is this invalid? It may not be entirely obvious. And what you can also do is put a validation summary in. And this is another component that is built into Blazor. And now if I refresh this and then just try that again, I really wasn't lying when I said there'd be lots of browser refreshing in this demo. So if I put, if I leave that blank and press submit, now we get this validation summary coming up. So this is actually really powerful, and you don't have to use data annotations. So I did a blog post actually recently about using Fluent validation. And beyond that, actually being able to have rules that run on the client and also run when you post to a backend. So if you posted this form to a server API, tempting though it is to trust the client-side validation, we've probably learned that that's not the best idea because it's easily, faked or overridden. So Fluent validation is quite a nice way of declaring rules for your forms. And then it is possible to run those rules both on the client, like we've just seen, and literally it's a case of just swapping out this validator for a different validator, but then also using the same Fluent validation rules on the server and the backend when you post to the API. So I think that combination is actually really powerful, and also highlights something which we can do with Blazor that you can't really do with JavaScript easily anyway, which is to share a model. So for example, this model here, you could actually have that in a separate class library and then share it with both your client-side web application and your backend API, which opens up all sorts of possibilities about serializing and deserializing data using the same model, which is a big improvement. So edit forms, that's how they basically work. As I say, you can swap this validator and you can, do all sorts in here. You could even put some crazy regex if you wanted to into there. And then do what I always do when I do regex, which is if I need to validate an email, for example, just look up the regex for validating an email and plug it in, and away you go. Apologies to any regex experts on the call. So that's edit forms. Now, so far, we've been dealing with components that are kind of standalone. So we have, one component, another component, another component. But that's only going to get us so far, because sooner or later, we're going to want to communicate between components. And that's where we can use something in Blazor called parameters. So if I head over to greeting again, just for a moment. So what it might be quite nice to do is to pass a name into this component. So instead of just hard coding my name in there or anyone else's name, we might want to pass that in. So for example, up here, we may wish to say hello, and then this could come from a database or, wherever it's going to come from. And then because we're dealing with components, we can have lots of them. And if we really wanted to, we could, as I say, drive this some data, and I'm just going to show complete lack of imagination with my names at this point. But we could drive this some data, so we could actually have a list, and we could loop over the list, and we could render a greeting for each one, and we could pass in a name from a list of people, for example. So how do we do that? Well, at the moment, if I try and run this, we're going to run into a problem. In a way, we're going to run into two problems, actually. So the first problem is that at this point, error messages in Blazor are difficult at times to work with, I think. And again, this is possibly something that will improve. I think it's kind of interesting why it's hard to sometimes deal with. Sometimes I think it's because the error is a bit misleading. And then even if the error is clear, I think it's because of the way it shows you the whole stack trace and the error in one big block of red text all in one place. So I think this is something that could be improved. But what this is basically saying, obscured by my Zoom call actually, but what this is saying is kind of logical at this point, that the greeting component does not have a property matching the name. So we can solve that if we head over to greeting. This is just a private field, so it doesn't really know what that is or how to access it from the outside. But we can do actually, we can use that, but we can just make it public. We can change it to name and then just update where we're using that. Go to this. And the crucial bit is to mark this up as a parameter. I think that's just Rider being a bit slow on the uptake there with that one, so I'll ignore that. As I say, it does occasionally lose track. But if I refresh when that's finished building, oh, my mistake. I know what this is. It's a property. So these need to be properties. So I'll just build that again. That is not the first time that I've had that problem either. So I'll just hardcode this to Jon to start with, and then there you go. So that's it. So that needs to be a property marked up as parameter. Refreshes now. Okay, and there you go. So that opens the door to what we looked at before of saying, look, we're going to take a UI or a design, we're going to break it down into components, we're going to build those components, and then when we need to, we're going to pass data into those components. And if we want to, reuse the same component in lots of different places, passing in data. So this is really powerful at this point. But it gets even more interesting, I think, when you think about, well, look, let's take, for example, the requirements builder dashboard. So this page currently, our index page, is kind of, well, I'm allowed to say it ugly. You're welcome to say it's ugly too. And, HRs and stuff, and it's all got a bit out of hand. So how might we build a kind of dashboard here using panels that look half decent, which also show these components? So we want to keep the content, but we want to make it look nicer. Well, if you've done work with things like React or Angular, and I think really any of the JavaScript frameworks, what you may expect to be able to do is to wrap any given element like this, so a component, inside another component. So obviously we could do that just with standard HTML. So we could say, div, and then put the component in there. But we can also use our own components in the same way. So what we're aiming for here is to say, look, I've got this panel component, which already exists in the code, and I want to essentially throw one of those on the page, and inside that panel, I want to show my, in this case, greeting component. Well, I'm just going to take that out for a minute and just show you the panel itself. So if I just put a panel on there and refresh this, okay, so I'll just give you a second to all admire my Bootstrap skills there with that panel. And then what you can do is you can give this a title, and we'll look at this in a sec, how this works, but say greeting. I promise you, actually, when we get to the Tailwind, you'll see why it's so much easier to, even with my CSS skills, to do half decent looking UI with Tailwind CSS. So greeting, there you go. So what's that actually doing? Like, how is that working? And would it work if I uncommented this at the moment? The answer to that is no, it would not. It would break, and I can show you why. So this is the panel component. So this is just Bootstrap at this point, really. And you can see we've got the parameters, so that thing that we just talked about, a property for a title here that we can render in the markup. And we've just got hard-coded this contents go here string at the moment. So that explains what we're seeing over here. But what I really want to do is show, the middle of my element, if you like, whatever I've defined on index in here. So let's head back to index for a second. If I uncomment this is unlikely to work at this point because we haven't really handled it. And we're probably back, there you go, to one of our big red walls of error. And it's basically saying here that this object does not have a property matching the name child content. So what we're leaning on here is a convention in the way Blazor components work, that if you want to render that kind of middle bit of the content, what you need is a parameter. And it just needs to have a certain name, which is child content, but it also needs to be a special kind of type of parameter, which is a render fragment. So it kind of is what it sounds like, actually, which is that we're going to pass in a fragment of content, and we're going to, as I say, use this name because that will auto magically wire this up for us. And then we're going to show that just using standard one-way binding up here. So if I now refresh this with a bit of luck, we should have our, there you go. So we've got our panel and we've got our content within the panel, and that's, what that does is it opens the door to basically exactly this scenario, creating things like a dashboard where you have this reusable component now, which you can pass a title into, you could pass a footer into that, whatever it might be. And now we're free to, I won't do all of them just because it would be a little boring to sit and watch, but we can essentially wrap anything we like now in here. If I just refresh that. And there you go. But what's likely to happen with any application like this is you're going to come to a point where you say, well, that's great, and the panel we have is good, but we need the panel to do something else or something more. So for example, we need different color panels, or we need the panels to be collapsible or expandable or take up different space on the dashboard. So what's really powerful about this is that actually we now have one component. So things like making it collapsible, we can probably do in the panel component itself, just interacting with the DOM and making it so, I don't know, when you click a button, it hides and shows elements. So that's really powerful. But then there's that other bit of saying, well, look, we want to make some panels red or some panels, slightly different. and this is where we have a really interesting thing that we can do when we're talking about components, which is follow the open close principle. So this idea that rather than modify the panel we already have, we can wrap that panel inside another more specialized version of the panel. And that actually by doing that, we make fewer changes to our system whilst also being able to continuously improve it and extend it. So we just have a quick look at that, and then we're kind of whizzing towards the end of the first demo. So hopefully we're good for time. So what I'll do is I'll just create a more specialized panel over here, and we'll just call it, I don't know, important panel dot razor. I don't know. I don't think my imagination is good enough at this point, at this time of night, after spending all day with the kids, to come up with anything more imaginative. So if we do important panel, and we'd render this on the index page, and because we're kind of wrapping a component that already exists, the obvious thing to do is to use the component that already exists. So, you know, panel title and content, and it's kind of interesting what we're trying to do here. We're trying to use this as though it were a panel, which means we will want to bring in properties for the title, and we'll want to bring in the render fragment thing again. So we'll do that. Render fragment child content. Okay, so this is, if we just pass those along, if you like. So just forward these along for a second. Okay, so what we have is a stand-in replacement now for our panel, which at this point will be exactly the same. But it's always good to test these things before we celebrate too hard, because we've all been bitten by the thing that looks like it should work and doesn't. So I'm just going to put important panel here, and then refresh this and just check that I still have. There you go. So at the moment, exactly the same. But this email panel is a different component now. It just happens to wrap an existing component. And what that allows us to do is to do slightly different things. So, for example, we could put a property on here called, oh, I don't know, panel name or something, and just give that, just let that be a string. And just, for example, return, you know, we could just return the title, maybe interpolate the title, and then put something else on it. So that'll be one thing we can do here, and just say important title or something. I won't do that though. But the point is, we could, I don't think it needs to be that. I will do actually, just to prove the point. So say, I don't know, you want to do this like that. And then if we bind to that up here, so panel name. So without making any changes to panel, we can do some things, and this would be one of them. We can kind of just, you know, tweak the behavior that way. But say for the color, say we wanted to make this red or something. Well, we are sometimes going to have to change the existing component if it doesn't do something we need it to. So for example, in this case, panel doesn't actually have a way of changing the color. But what we can do is give it a way of changing its color, and then allow the more specialized component, which in this case is this one, to set the color to red, for example. And I'll show how we do that now, and then very quickly how we can make it a bit easier to maintain going forwards. So first of all, if we want to make a panel have a color, that is going to take a change to the existing panel, because there's no way of it currently doing it at the moment. And what we can do, and I'm just going to copy this in because I always forget the syntax, in panel is we're going to bring in a parameter, and we're just going to say, now this, whether or not you think using inline styles is a good idea is going to affect what you think of this particular example. But just to kind of prove a point, and because it's the quickest way I can think of to do it, if we accept, you know, a border parameter at this point, what we can do is say, I'm basically going to just use that to set the style. So set this to style. And what style does in this case is just take whatever you pass in as that border parameter and assign it to this, you know, border colon style. So as I say, we can probably debate the merits of that particular approach. But what it does allow us to do is to say border equals, 1px solid red. And interestingly, this kind of starts to lead us towards the Tailwind approach, which is infinitely better than just doing inline styles. But with that in place, if I now refresh, we've got our red important panel. And obviously from here, you could create other panels, you could override their behavior, you could change things like this title down here. But there is a problem which you might have spotted, which is this is good, and obviously it allows us to make some specialized components without necessarily changing the original components. But it feels like we've got another problem now, which is that if we do go and add another property to panel, for example, all these specialized components, and there could be loads of them, have also got to be updated to basically act as a middleman for that parameter. So if we added a new parameter to this, thinking ahead, say it's collapsible or not. So this could be collapsible. Essentially, all of these specialized versions would have to probably take collapsible in as a parameter and forward it along, which means to extend that behavior of the panel, we've actually got to go and update all of the specialized versions, which feels like a bit of work we don't want to do, and we don't have to. So what we can do instead is actually take in a dictionary of attributes. So if we take in a dictionary, and I'm pretty sure it's string objects, and just give this a name, we can kill these kind of specific ones, including child content. And what we can do instead is something called, and I think this is probably the best name in all of Blazor, which is attribute splatting. It's just something about splatting, I don't know why. So what we can do here is we can splat these parameters. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that you can say that dictionary, just attach it to this element. Well, not attach it, but basically take everything. I mean, if you wrote this, what you basically do is loop through this dictionary and assign every attribute. So that's what that's doing. So it's going to take any attribute we send in and splat it, hence the name, onto this panel. But we just need to do one more thing, which is tell this to capture anything that's unmatched. And what that means is if we haven't explicitly included, for example, a title parameter ourselves, then if we specify one when we use this panel, bring it into this attributes dictionary, and then splat this dictionary, I'm just going to keep saying it, splat this dictionary onto the attributes. So essentially it just removes all the middleman code that we would otherwise have to write. So first of all, does that work? Let's have a look. Yes, it does. And I can just prove that works if I go to index here and change this title to something else. So what this is doing is taking title, which, not that one, this one. So it's taking title, and we haven't actually got a parameter for title on important panel, but what it's going to do is grab it into this dictionary, put it onto the panel and forward it along. And all that really means is that from a maintenance point of view now, any changes to panel do not always require you to go to all your specialized implementations of panel and change them all, just to get the values to go all the way through. And I think that's probably it for our first demo.
Wonderful. Hopefully everyone really enjoyed that. I think so many of the things that Jon highlighted there, when you're starting out with Blazor in earnest, you're going to come across all of these issues. And I thought some of the things you mentioned there, Jon, with regards to the model sharing and sharing services, and really getting up to speed with attributes, I think everyone can really benefit from that today. Thank you so much for that, Jon. I think you deserve a well-earned break, and if anyone wants to grab a drink or a coffee or something, now's probably quite a good time. Just a little heads up in terms of what is coming future-wise. As I mentioned earlier on, we're currently working on a production-based Blazor WebAssembly application. It basically forms a booking application with a booking dashboard to kind of complement it, which we're doing for a local camper van company, to kind of share some of the journey that we've been on, really, to kind of put that together. And there's some quite interesting things in there with Stripe payments and a lot of kind of code sharing. So we're probably looking at maybe hosting something in September, if anyone would like to kind of join us on that journey. But sooner than that, we have our very own Chris Sainty next month. It's actually quite early on in the month, I believe, so it won't feel like too far away. And he is kindly presenting a deep dive into Blazor routing. And if you know, as I'm sure some of you are aware, whenever you start to develop in Blazor in earnest, routing becomes something that you need to be able to manage and understand. Chris, would you like to add a couple of comments about the presentation next month?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to start off by saying I've not written it yet, so in true in heavy preparation that I do. Yeah, I'm actually busy writing a book at the moment, so I'm sort of quite tied up with that. But yeah, if you've got anything you want to see in the talk, now is a great time. And I'm sure I can work it in there. What it'll be is it'll basically be an extended version of what I did for the .NET Conf Focus on Blazor event. So I'm going to start off with that as the basis of the talk. That was only a 30-minute talk, so it was quite rushed. So I'll be expanding on a few of the areas that I went into there, going into a bit more detail, and probably spending a bit more time in kind of showing some demos and stuff like that. The routing system in Blazor is quite interesting. There's quite a lot that goes on. So yeah, I can definitely fill a good hour with that. So so yeah, but if there is anything specific, please shout and I'll make sure I cover it. But other than that, yeah, it'll just be nuts and bolts stuff, really.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. We're looking forward to that, and also looking forward to seeing some excerpts from the book at some point. And you know,
free copies, wasn't it? You said 3 copies.
It depends. You got insomnia. I can cure it.
We'll find that Chris has got invitations all over the country when that goes into production. Well, if you're enjoying the content in our .NET Foundation user group, then please subscribe to the channel. Also hit the bell icon to get notifications of when we upload new content. If you have a technical topic that others could benefit from, whether it be .NET, Azure or Focus on Blazor, then reach out for a future presentation. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation as much as we did, and we look forward to seeing you next time.